Hey everyone, how are you doing? This is Andy Hall. You're watching a special episode here on the Laughing and Disbelief channel. With me today is the Secular Cinephile himself, or maybe I should call you Dr. Secular Cinephile.
Secular Cinephile works fine.
Fantastic. Andrew, how do you pronounce your last name, Andrew?
Spitznas.
Spitznas. All right, very good. Well, thanks for coming on the show today. You have a blog, Secular Cinephile, on Patheos on the Nonreligious channel. I've been looking through it. I'm not as much of a movie buff as you are, but you cover some movies pretty in depth. And I thought it'd be great to have you on the show.
Well, I'm very glad you invited me. I appreciate it.
Sure. So for people who aren't acquainted with your blog, what do you do on Secular Cinephile?
Yeah, Dale McGowan, our editor, was kind enough to invite me on, I guess, 2014, 2015. And, you know, basically I see what's playing at the multiplex or at the art house cinemas over this past year in particular, what's playing virtually. And I spend about 4 days perusing what's arriving, what's coming, and I try to do a screening process to see what looks appealing, what looks interesting, because I really don't like dissing films. I really love artists and I love what they do, so I really look for something that I can analyze, write about, potentially introduce to my readers as something they may not see otherwise. And then I sit down and write 1 or 2 reviews each weekend. Try to go for about 800 words, give or take a few hundred, so I can provide a spoiler-free, overview of the plot, and analyze what's going on as far as the visuals, the sound, the themes. And as a secular humanist / atheist, I try to bring that perspective into my reviews if it's relevant. I don't try to shoehorn things in. If it's a Marvel superhero movie that really doesn't deal with existential questions. And then as you alluded to earlier, I'm a psychiatrist. So if there are psychological or mental health themes, I address those, bringing my psychiatric knowledge base in.
I was reading through one of your reviews, and it was on Crime of the Century, and you sold me on that. You sold me on that, and I need to watch it.
It's a great film, and Alex Gibney has just been doing incredible work for so long. I think it was Taxi to the Dark Side that he won an Oscar for, but he can be relied upon to direct and write 1 or 2 solid documentaries a year. Every once in a while, it may be stuffed with a little too much filler, but I use a 5-star rating system, and consistently they're 3.5, 4.5 star films. They are just really well done. He doesn't necessarily deviate from the standard documentary formula of talking heads, video footage, those sorts of things, but he uses that formula magnificently. And of interest for us as secular humanists, a couple of his really good recent films, recent meaning in the past decade. One looked at the sexual abuse scandal within the Catholic Church. He did another one that looked at Scientology. I believe it's called Scientology in the Prison of Belief. And for that one, I probably went a bit overboard. I analyzed the film and looked at how he presents Scientology and how that reflects in a broad way as far as the deleterious ways that religion impact on society and individual well-being.
What really touched me about your review of Crime of the Century is about how the Sackler family and who was it, Purdue Pharmaceuticals orchestrated the opioid epidemic.
Yeah, it was, and he presents it very compellingly, even bringing on board a couple of former drug reps for that company and the one who did fentanyl as well. and showing how they would go into doctors' offices and manage to make a pain rating scale the quote fifth vital sign, and presenting that it was not an epidemic of opiate abuse, but it was an epidemic of untreated pain, and confabulating, covering the data that these were not addictive substances. And then once the addiction started rolling out, they played the classic blame the victim card, where it's not our medications that are problematic, it's the addicts who are doing it.
Right. I've heard that they're declaring or trying to declare bankruptcy to get out of a lot of the legal fees or a lot of the people that are suing them with class action suits.
That's right. That's right. And having recently moved out of the Bible Belt, it was interesting to see my region on camera again. And usually when it's East Tennessee or Southwest Virginia, it's how are we embarrassing the world yet again? But in this case, there were regional, would it be district attorneys, I guess, who were instrumental in Abingdon, Virginia, which is 45 minutes away from where I lived, who were instrumental in creating these class action lawsuits. So props to them for noticing what was happening in the community. And similarly, it was a West Virginia family doc who wrote to Purdue Pharma and thankfully kept a really good paper trail of saying, this is what is happening in my town. You are not talking about this. You need to do something about it. And of course, they sent them the boilerplate reply, non-admission of guilt, it's not a problem, and it was business as usual.
Right, right. In terms of other films, how does your background in psychiatry inform your observation and analysis of different movies?
Yeah, it's on a few different levels. I think first off, I was lucky enough to be trained in psychiatry at a time where we were still trained to be psychotherapists as well as doing diagnosis and medication management. So for the majority of my career, I was a psychotherapist in addition to writing prescriptions. And there's a very similar process that happens in watching a film as is involved in doing psychotherapy or doing a psychiatric assessment, where you're not only listening to the words, but you're observing the individual. You're listening to their history, their story. How does it mesh with typical diagnoses? How is it unique to them? So you're listening to all these aspects, and you're bringing in your own knowledge base, your own history of treating individuals who may have similar issues. And it's a very similar kind of diffuse attention that ideally you bring to a film, where a lot of critics will say the first viewing is all about watching the story and following the plot. And the second viewing is more about the surrounding elements, the soundtrack, the film score, the visuals, and paying more attention to the themes. So ideally, especially since I write 1 or 2 reviews a week, I try to do some of that in that first viewing. And if I love a film, I'll go back and watch it a second time. So that's one sense that, just in a very general sense, I think my psychological training has been of help. It was also a almost literal foot in the door. My first explorations of writing about cinema were for mental health audiences, and looking at mental health themes in cinema, where I dug in deep to the films of Akira Kurosawa, the director who was active in Japan from 1943 to 1993, and analyzed the themes of trauma and recovery in his cinema, and ended up getting an academic book chapter out of that and speaking to audiences about it. And then from there, it just became a more global interest in cinema. And then lastly, again, I look for themes that apply to my training. So if there's a film that looks at, let's say, autism sensitively, I really love bringing that to my readers' attention. You know, a really good film like the documentary Life Animated, about a kid who is non-verbally autistic and was watching and watching these Disney films over and over again. And it was through them that he started to become verbal. And actually, his parents were stunned to realize there was a whole lot going on in his mind when he was silent. He could pick out the themes of the Disney films and say how this related to his emotional state. So it's a beautifully done film looking at that. Another one last year was The Reason I Jump, that went beyond a Western perspective to look at nonverbal individuals with autism in Africa, India, Japan, Great Britain, and the United States. But it was beautifully done. So if I see films like that, I look to bring those to the audience's attention. And then when psychiatrists or the mental health profession is looked at well or looked at terribly, I like to look at that and talk about it. So I haven't written it. Well, actually, I did write about Hal Ashby once upon a time, but Harold and Maude is a great example of looking at this troubled adolescent or young adult, and the mental health realm, the Catholic priests were advising him, and it's done very comically, but in a way that feels somewhat authentic too. And then you have other films, say The Joker of a couple of years ago, where I thought it was just deplorable how mental illness and the realm of mental health treatment was presented. So so those are some of the ways that I bring it in. Yeah.
Sure. What's your favorite Kurosawa movie?
It's going to vary from month to month. I mean, here again, it's my medical background, but I really freaking love Redbeard, and it doesn't get enough attention. It's about a 19th century physician who is training a young doctor, and it has the classic Kurosawa theme of the mentor-mentee relationship and a person's moral formation, but it also brings in a world that is in flux and chaos, and how individuals respond to trauma. There are a lot of classic Kurosawa parallels. There's a woman who is sexually traumatized who, in a little bit over the top form, becomes a killer of men who are trying to assault her. And then that is set up with a parallel of a child prostitute that the clinic rescues. And it looks at these are the different ways that one can respond to trauma, where you just lash out against the world, or in the case of this child prostitute who is brought into the fold of the clinic, you can turn your experience into a way to help others. And it's just magnificently filmed in black and white, great framing of the scenes, wonderful storytelling. So I really like that one. High and Low is another favorite of mine. It's another one from his late black and white period where it's a police procedural, but it harkens back to some of his early Marxist tendencies, where he contrasts the folks who are living high above the town, and those who are down below, who are, struggling with poverty, and what happens when those two economic strata collide with each other. And then, of course, I'm a sucker for Seven Samurai. I can watch that one. I can watch that every 6 months and still get something out of it.
Yeah. I haven't seen Redbeard. Ron?
Yes, that would be another of my favorites. Absolutely.
Yeah. And of course, for those of you who aren't, I'm looking at the microphone when I'm talking to the audience there. But for those of you who haven't seen these Kurosawa movies, they are definitely worth your time. One of the moments in Ron that resonates with me is when the fool character says that the gods cannot save us from ourselves. Something like that. Yep. And on any given month, that would be in my top 3 as well.
it's like Seven Samurai, where it's a 3-hour film, but it doesn't feel like a 3-hour film. And and this resonated me as someone who was emerging from Christianity when I first watched it. The whole question of theodicy, or where is God in a suffering world? There's the overt dialogue like that, but then the final scene has the devout blind guy standing on a cliff, and he drops a Buddha scroll into this opening in the rock, so it becomes inaccessible to him. So the last shots are, there's this Buddha image staring down from this ravine helplessly, and then the camera pulls back in a triple shot, and you see this blind monk is utterly alone in the world. So, just magnificently done.
There was also a movie with Richard Gere, August Rain, was it?
Don't know that one.
It was about, it was a commentary, and like you were talking about Kurosawa, about going through the process, the healing process, and August referring to the atomic bomb droppings on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and I think it was done in the 80s at some point.
Yeah, Rhapsody in August. Yeah.
That's it, Rhapsody in August.
Oh, it is a magnificent film, and it was fascinating, kind of like you brought in Scorsese to play Vincent Van Gogh in Dreams, that there are these Westerners who are dying to be in his films because he was such an influence in 1970s American cinema. But that is a marvelous film about, I believe she's a survivor of Nagasaki. And again, it is about those themes of trauma and recovery, and how the younger generation, namely her children, don't really get her piety and the importance of community for, but it's the grandchildren who start to resonate with this. Right. And the very final sequence, Kurosawa loved rainstorms. That very final sequence in the rainstorm with her is just, for me, one of the all-time great scenes in cinema.
We talked about some really good movies. What makes a bad movie?
So many possibilities. I think one of the big ones for me is when it's lazily shot, where it's all the reverse shot over the shoulder, where there's no variety, so it becomes tedious in that respect. Another one is if the music is too on point, Mickey Mousing through the drama and overtly manipulating your emotions. I don't mind a film preaching at me if it does well, but if it's manipulating like that, that's certainly a pet peeve. And then if a film sticks too safely to formula, whether it's the romantic comedy that is about, the relationship that the individuals are not happy in. Here's the guy on the side who is the right guy for her. They have a third act crisis fight, and of course it all ends up being okay at the end. Or the superhero movie, and I like some superhero movies, so I'm not just crapping on them all the time, but the tendency so late has been for the stakes to be absurdly high, where, whether it was a Star Trek film where they blew up the planet, or the last Avenger, or the second to last Avengers film where half of the population just disappears. And the stakes just become so high that it almost becomes meaningless. So I guess those would be some of the films, or if they're too clumsy in their preaching or sending a message, the documentary that relies too heavily on filler footage, so many of the true crime documentaries, or they do all the pointless drone shots just to fill in the space. So I guess I look for I like formula. I appreciate formula. In some ways, Borat, for example, is a formulaic comedy in terms of the romance being more between Borat and Azamat, his producer, but they have their rupture and then they come together again. But for me, it's probably the best comedy of the past 15 years. So it does that formula, but it subverts it in wonderful ways.